All right. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Wise Wealth Podcast with Sean and I. Today, we're taking a little bit of a deeper look at some financial planning topics. Obviously, looking through the Canadian context, and our goal with these episodes is always to help you make better and more informed financial planning decisions. So, recently, we've been having some great conversation with people exploring our retirement planning services. So, either fee-for-service planning or a longer term relationship. And often right before they become clients, the most important questions come out. And one recent discussion raised some thoughtful concerns around uncertainty, risk, guaranteed investments, and what really matters in that 5 to 10 years out from retirement range. And so we thought, why not get Sean's opinion on this? And so I'm going to ask him some questions around those four main things. Specifically, do Monte Carlo simulations actually prepare us for the uncertainties of life? We'll unpack what they actually are. Are guarantees like GICs truly dead? It's a comment we've gotten on our YouTube channel many times, like GICs are dead, don't use them. Or are they still important for financial planning? Is avoiding probate really one of the most important goals in estate planning? And finally, what should you be focusing on in that 5 to 10 year range out from retirement? So, Sean, let's dive into Monte Carlo simulations. What are they, and what are they not? Where do they come up short?
Monte Carlo simulations are a great part of the planning process. I think it's a very, very useful tool to use. And so for those of you that aren't familiar with what a Monte Carlo is, it's basically a mathematical model that runs your retirement portfolio through a series of various sequences of return. And it's really good at sort of taking the typical sort of average return. Let's say you got 6% in your portfolio. What does your retirement look like? And it runs it through the impacts of what if you get a sequence of bad years? What if you get volatility clusters? What if you get anomalies in performance? And so it'll run your portfolio draw rate and your portfolio through a lens of all these different simulations. So it's good from the standpoint of it begins to give you some idea as to whether there's some stress points in your plan. In other words, if you get a bad sequence of return, would you be in a situation where, you're not going to have a portfolio that lasts to 90, it's going to last to 75. And the other thing that it does give you sort of a probability of success. So, a Monte Carlo simulation is going to run your portfolio and your drawdown rate through all these sequences of return, and then give you a probability of success looking at literally thousands and thousands of these sequences. And then it'll often give you, from at least a mathematical standpoint, a probability of success. So for all of us, if we're doing some number crunching and the program says, hey, you've got like 100% chance of success, or maybe more than that, 103% chance of success. Yeah, that kind of gives you some, assurance, maybe confidence. Maybe you're going, okay, maybe I can make this retirement thing work. I think it's helpful to know those numbers. But the problem with the Monte Carlo simulations is it's done sort of in isolation of real life. And where Monte Carlo simulations fall short is they don't model life, they model markets and sequences of return. And it's important we differentiate between those two things.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the key point of Monte Carlo simulations is that they're giving you an answer about probability. And so across all possible market paths, how often does this plan work, right? And I mean, if you're getting 100% likelihood, you have a lot of buffer room. Awesome. All right, let's move on.
Yeah. So I think one of the things about the Monte Carlo is that it doesn't simulate the inevitable things that are going to happen in life, right? It could be a job loss. It could be health events that create spikes and anomalies, not market fluctuations. It could be divorce or separation. The one that we often see, and it's been in the news a lot the last little while, would be helping adult children. Like how many clients have built that into their model in any very structured way? Not a lot. And yet a lot of retirees are helping their adult children or their grandchildren because of price inflation. And of course, behavioral changes. You can have the best, financial modeling in the world, but your behavior ultimately is going to really drive a lot of the success of your planning.
Yeah. That's why it's super important to get your plans updated. You can get a plan at 65, but by 75, 80, things might have changed a lot. Based on that, are there better ways of dealing with uncertainty?
I think there's a whole bunch of things that can be built into the plan to deal with uncertainty. So again, just to reiterate, Monte Carlo lets you know maybe at that level of analysis where the breakpoints are in your plan potentially. But a really good way of dealing with uncertainty in going forward with your planning is number one, just make sure you've got some flexibility in your plan. One of the things we say to clients all the time is just have budget flexibility. Don't be in a situation where it's pedal to the metal all the time, that if there's uncertainty or market volatility or life events that blindside you, that you've got some budgetary flexibility. And the other thing is can your plan be structured so it's not reliant on just one major income source? So if you look at Monte Carlo simulations, it's a real big focus on your portfolio, right? And how does it respond to different tensions and volatility over the years? But maybe you need to structure your retirement plan with tiered income sources. So what do we mean by that? Well, most of you will have tiered already. So if you look at your government benefits, that's one source of income. And if you look at, if you go to defined contribution pension plan or defined benefit plan, that's another source. And then you're now looking at your buckets of, TFSAs, RSPs, RIFs, non-registered accounts, maybe some money in your corporate account. And maybe some of those accounts could be structured in such a way that, again, you've got another level of guarantee. And we'll actually talk about this a little bit in the podcast. But guarantees like GICs, annuity contracts, that kind of thing, help you to de-risk, where you're pulling some money out of the market and not taking on all that liability potentially, and passing the liability to a large institution that might issue a guaranteed contract or a guaranteed monthly income for you. And then the last area is build in some liquidity buffers in your plan. So I always say to clients, you know what, let's run the Monte Carlos, let's stress test, but make sure that these other buffers are in place just in case. Have budget flexibility, have that cash wedge, or what we call the timeline investment portfolio, and something as simple as having a line of credit. Have a line of credit in place, approved before you retire, just in case. Most people don't want to use it, but if you needed to use it because of volatility and uncertainty that you experience in life, you'll be glad that it's there for you.
Yeah, 100%. Well, you kind of gave away this next section, but are GICs dead? Are guaranteed investments like that, they can barely keep up with inflation? Why even have them in the portfolio? How would you answer that? Do they still have a role in planning?
Yeah, they definitely have a role, I think still. Rates have been low for a while. They spiked a little bit in 2022. But, it's completely valid to say that GICs are not going to generate enough return to cope with inflation and taxes, and they're going to lose their purchasing power. Those things are true. But I think that having a blanket statement like, guarantees GICs are dead, and like you said on the YouTube channel, we sometimes get those comments. It's never a toggle switch. I think it's nuanced. And so obviously, having GICs in your portfolio will certainly provide the potential of being a drag to performance, right? That's certainly true. However, why could they play an important role? I think one of the main things they do is they basically stabilize our behavior or how we respond to volatility in the world. So a very simple example is if I have a client and they've got a cash wedge made up of GICs, and they've got three years worth of income covered in that GIC portfolio ladder. If the market drops 25%, how will that client respond to that volatility compared to the client that has 6 months worth of cash and is more fully invested? I can tell you, no matter how disciplined the second client is, they're going to go through a lot more anxiety than the client that has 3 years worth of guarantees in their portfolio. So it really reinforces behavior. It helps people to act with discipline during periods of volatility because they have a reserve or buffer. Is there a cost theoretically long-term in terms of performance? Yeah, I think we could argue that. The market's up most of the time, right? But will volatility hit? And it's all kinds of volatility, not just the markets? Absolutely. So having that cash buffer using GICs helps to deal with that. So it funds those essential expenses. It creates, a psychological permission to take risk elsewhere because you've already looked after the short term. And it just provides a little more certainty. So, you know, guarantees work well as long as you understand where they're properly placed. First of all, you go, yep, I know they're not tax efficient, particularly for non-reg. I know that they're probably best held within a tax deferred account, right? So I'm not paying full boogie tax on the interest. And so really it's not a question about GICs are good or bad. It really is, what job is the money supposed to do? Like, why am I putting different investments in different parts of our portfolio? It's because it has a specific purpose. It might be a small amount of your portfolio, but I think given volatility is a reality, I think it's a necessary piece. So that would be our perspective on it. It's not an all or nothing sort of question.
Yeah, it's super good. Intentionality behind where you put your money and the purpose behind it, super, super important. But thinking about risk, like, yeah, cash drag will decrease your expected return. But also, if you don't have a cash wedge or something like that, and you need to pull money out when the market's down, that's also a risk, right? So and our behavior when the market is really volatile can have a massive impact. So you can't really escape risk. You gotta choose one of them. So yeah, that's really good. Do you want to move on to probate, or was there anything else on that one?
No, I think those are the main points on that one. I do want to make one quick comment about the Monte Carlo simulation, just to underscore a few things we talked about. So one of the things about Monte Carlo, which I think a lot of folks, if they're watching our videos, probably don't realize, is that I know for sure with snap projections, the way snap handles volatility, we call it a modified Monte Carlo, but it's a little bit unique. So a lot of these Monte Carlo simulations, they take your portfolio and your draw rate, and they just run it through the sequence. Snap projections basically superimposes that volatility on top of your financial plan. So it's putting that volatility or variability lens through a whole bunch of other pieces. It's going to show you the impact on your tax planning, the inflation rates, a whole bunch of other pieces. So it's a more holistic approach to modeling volatility in a plan, whereas Monte Carlos is more specifically looking at often, here's your portfolio value, here's your return, here's the sequence of return. How long can you push out this money? So just an aside. Okay, so you wanted to, I guess the next area
Probate.
in terms of questions was what, probate?
Yeah. So probate obviously doesn't have the greatest reputation. Why do so many people want to avoid it at all costs?
Well, because it costs.
Yeah.
That's probably
lead-in.
the main reason. Yeah. So I think that the overwhelming objective for most people is, how do I get money to beneficiaries or the next generation for the least amount of cost to my estate and as quickly as possible? So there's no doubt that sidestepping probate has the potential for sure to do that. And we'll talk about ways you could do that just very briefly. But that would be the major driver. Quick, it's cost effective. How do we sort of get those assets past the probate process and directly into the hands of beneficiaries?
How can assets pass the people we want them to pass to?
It's, for the most part, there's two main ways of doing it. So one is through the probate process, where for all intents and purposes, what happens is that your will give instruction to how assets are to be distributed upon your death. And any assets that are directed by your will have to go into your estate, and they're subject to probate. So think of the probate process as you got your bucket, that's your estate, and your home, and your financial assets, and your earthly belongings. All that financial stuff goes into your estate. Your will articulates how that money is to be directed. And so that's one approach. The other major approach is through the operation of law. So there are laws in place, typically beneficiary designations and registration of assets that can help to sidestep the probate and process. So the most common ones we think about would be life insurance. Often will have beneficiary designations. If you have a listed beneficiary, that money on death will not go to the estate. It will go to the listed beneficiary, as an example. You can do the same thing with your RSP or RIF accounts. You can buy insurance contracts that are investments called seg funds, and you can have listed beneficiaries on those contracts. And so in addition to that, you have registration. So if I have an asset, let's say an investment account just in my name, upon my death, that asset will go into my estate and be subject to probate. If it's jointly registered, let's say with my spouse or partner, it will not go into the estate. It will go to the joint owner upon my death. And the same would apply if I have registered that asset with children or somebody else. So it's not a probatable asset. And so what you see a lot of times is people will make sure that they've got either beneficiary designations, right, or registrations on the accounts to make sure that as much as possible, money does not go to the estate subject to probate, and their beneficiaries will get the money directly. And those would be the main ways you can get assets to the people you love or to other beneficiaries.
So I guess the real question is not how do we eliminate probate. It's more what outcome are we trying to create for the people we care about, right? Like what's the purpose behind it, which goes back to planning. Awesome.
Yeah, like I think exactly. And so to me, it's like the GIC question, right? Is it all bad? No. So could we apply that lens through probate or not probate? It depends. So I'll give you a really good example of where you'd want assets going into the estate and to have the will direct those assets in terms of what has to happen. So think about, some people who want to give to charities. And in the tax code, there's an unlimited year of death charitable donation opportunity, and you can really reduce taxes to the estate or in the year of death tax filing quite dramatically through donations. The problem is that donation has to be outlined in your will. It has to be done by your executor. And so the money has to go into the estate. It's going to be subject to probate. And then the gifting is going to take place. And then in the year of death filing or the estate, they will get a tax deduction that can be used to offset taxes. So there's an example where money does have to go into the estate subject to probate. Take advantage of that. The other option that comes up often is trusts. You'll see people set up trusts for either minor beneficiaries or for other purposes. For estate protection, creditor protection, other kinds of issues. You sometimes see spousal trusts where money will go in for the protection and management of a spouse, and then upon the spouse's death, then the money will go to the next generation. So there are uses of trusts. Again, money has to go into the estate. It's going to be subject to probate. And then once that process is completed, that money gets pushed into the trust. As it relates to even family unity, I will often say to families, unless it's like kumbaya and everyone's getting along, there can be problems where if you, in a last to die scenario, mom and dad are gone now, and you push all the assets to the kids, let's say, upon last to die and have direct beneficiaries or joint registration, okay, that's going to save time and money for sure, but it could lead to other complications. So talk about one that happens from time to time. You've got a large RIF account balance with a deferred tax liability. That tax liability can be deferred on a first to die, and then on a last to die in a couple of situations, it's going to get triggered. What's interesting is on death of the last to die, the RIF assets can be released to the beneficiaries. Let's say it's 2 children, and the assets get released, and there's no requirement by the financial institution to withhold tax. So let's say it's a $300,000 RIF account. It's going to get paid out to the beneficiaries. There's theoretically $150,000 tax liability. And a few months down the road, the executor's doing the tax filings and get everything organized, and they realize that there's an outstanding tax liability of $150K. And that money's already been, given to the kids. No tax was held. Conversations didn't happen. One kid built a rumpus room, went on a nice trip, and the other, did something else, a couple of nice cars, and now they're looking to find money. Money's gone. They're looking to find the money. So you got issues. Or, so sometimes we say to clients, it may not be a bad idea on a last to die to have everything go to the estate. The executor buttons everything down, gets a clearance certificate from CRA, everything's dealt with appropriately. You got a bow on it. And once all that's done, then you release assets to the beneficiaries that are listed under the terms of the will. So I think the big thing here is that sometimes either centralized administration like that can make sense. If there's family conflict, it can make sense to have the estate and probate process involved. It's sometimes easier to provide equalization among beneficiaries because sometimes you see some beneficiaries getting a RIF account and others getting a TFSA and others getting maybe some money as a joint registered on a non-registered account. It just creates confusion. Why don't you just dump everything into the estate and then have one common pool and begin allocating out assets? So there's bunch of reasons why people may want to consider the probate. So again, it's situationally specific for sure.
Yeah. Nuance. All right.
Yeah.
Approaching retirement, 5 to 10 years out from retirement. So obviously one of the most common questions we get, and retirement's approaching, what should I be doing 5 to 10 years out from retirement? So if you could narrow it down, obviously there's a million different things, but what actually matters the most?
Well, there's a few things to really keep in mind. There's the obvious one where you're beginning to turn your attention from, sort of asset accumulation and build up to generating income. So, a lot of people, it's hard for them to make that transition where they're putting money away, they're building their portfolio, they're saving for retirement, and they really haven't leaned into, okay, that's all great, but how are you going to generate income out of this vehicle? And how much income do you need to generate from your portfolio? The two things are connected. So 10 years is ideal. Like if you can really look at the projections about potential portfolio value at retirement, that's going to give you some guidance as to whether you need to maybe put a little more focus to your savings, or maybe you've got enough savings. One interesting thing about that analysis is that you've got people who are just pounding away at their RSP accounts, and yet they might be at a point where as they get closer to retirement, the RSP planning may not be quite as important, and that a renewed focus on building up TFSA value or non-registered account value could be more important, again, to provide buffer and flexibility during retirement years. So you definitely want to have a situation, I think, for most people where they've got that sort of diversified approach to buckets, and sometimes giving up on some of those tax deductions before you retire to get those buckets filled up can make sense. The average is, the next point is just making sure that you're focused in on, how you tax effectively plan your retirement. And that gets into, particularly if you have a partner, sort of income splitting strategies. One really common one is you'll see one of the partner, like in a couple situations, there are lots of RSPs where you define contribution pension plan, maybe a little bit of annuity income. The other partner doesn't have as much. And as you look at their retirement, they have not done a really good job of trying to equalizing the pots, right? So one's overweighted in terms of registered assets, the other one's underweighted. And for people that don't have defined benefit pension plans, they can't start income splitting until age 65 on their RIF payments or money coming out of their RSPs. But if they're retiring before age 65, the higher income spouse having spousal RSP contributions and getting money in the hands of the lower income spouse prior to retirement is a really important thing to keep an eye on. How do we optimize tax for the first 5 years of retirement? Let's say we retire at 60. We can't start splitting income until 65. Well, you need to think about that a few years before you retire so you can do that income splitting in your planning. The other thing is just focusing on, again, a sequence of return risk. So again, when we do projections, a lot of people will look at the linear returns. If I get 5.5%, I'm good, but that's not usually how life works. I mean, can be a lot of variability. So it gets back to the discussion on GICs. So as you get closer and closer to retirement, within 5 years for sure, you want to begin thinking about risk sequencing, reducing risk in your portfolio, putting those guarantees, beginning to make the shift from being an asset accumulator and builder to a deaccumulator. And part of that is building in a cash wedge or some more conservative components to your portfolio. And I guess the biggest one that we think about has nothing to do with money. And that's getting your head wrapped around, what does this transition look like from a psychological, emotional, relational purpose standpoint? This is not just a financial exercise, retirement. It is probably one of the biggest life transitions that you're going to go through. And the stats are quite alarming. If you look at seniors 65 plus, the incidence of depression, drug abuse, drug and alcohol abuse is very high. And you would think that people, and this is among all income groups in retirement. So you would think that if you've got lots of money and a great retirement plan, why would you ever be struggling emotionally or psychologically, right? How could that happen? You can be golfing every day, you're going to go on wonderful trips, you're going to do all this stuff. And of course, that works for a while, but ultimately we get fulfillment through purpose and meaning and structure, still having a reason to get up every day and making a difference, making a contribution. And relationships are critical, and you need to be, we use the word intentional all the time, but you need to be very intentional and building up those networks, building out what your schedule is going to look like, how you're going to cultivate meaning and purpose in your life. That is as important as your financial plan. I know most people that look at our videos are focused on the financial aspects. That's maybe, at the bottom of the planning pyramid. That's foundational for sure, but it's just a piece. And so
Yeah.
those would be the main points I would sort of make around that transition 5 to 10 years before.
Yeah, that's really good. So focus on your income. Don't obsess over just the number in the account, because you got to fund your retirement income in the best way possible. I think the point you make about sequence of returns risk is really important, because often when we just get online and we just use the calculators on there, it's like, what return do you want over this time horizon? I want 10% nominal, or more accurately, probably a 7. But that doesn't tell the full story. Like, if you get poor returns early on, it can have a really bad impact on your retirement income planning. The money early on is more valuable than the money later on. So that's really important. And behavioral planning, it's unbelievable. Even I'm talking to people like 30 years out from retirement. It's the same thing. And the earlier you can kind of introduce just how important the behavioral side of financial planning is, the way it's so much easier to plan, because you kind of get that out of the way and people start recognizing it in themselves. And so it's them just working through that. But it's just not it's not always a financial decision. The number is one thing, but I was literally talking to some people yesterday, and like, it's the, do I pay off my mortgage or do I invest type of conversation, right? They have a really low mortgage rate, although they're gonna have a higher rate soon. But it's that conversation where they just hate having a mortgage. It just like weighs on them. And it might make more sense to not pay down the mortgage quicker, but they just hate it. So it's not necessarily just a math equation.
Yeah. Well, in fact, we had a discussion with somebody yesterday, the two of us. We were talking about government benefits and when to take them, right? So it's a very common question that people have. And yet when you run the numbers, for most people, they're probably going to live to average life expectancy. And if you run the numbers, it makes sense to defer your Canada pension, as an example, more often than not to age 70 from 65. That gives you a 42% enhanced benefit, cost of living indexed. And yet still, the vast majority of people will take it earlier. And the reason for that is that they have this overwhelming concern that, what if I die prematurely? Then I'm not going to get, my money out of the plan. I've put money in for 40 years and I'm not going to get my fair share. So that's valid at one point, but it's a good example of a lot of financial decisions that people make where they're not really logical decisions. It's kind of gut feel and low probability. An actuary would say, if you're healthy at 60, you probably want to defer CPP. The high probability decision, right, even though you're just an N of 1, is to defer it and get that higher benefit. That's a smarter decision. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to do that. You might default to taking the money and run earlier. But we do that a lot in financial decision making. We rationalize and justify, and it's classic, right? We say we make financial decisions based on a rational sort of screen, but usually we make emotional decisions, then we justify with rationality after the fact. That's often
massage the numbers to make our decision look good. Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, major theme for this episode. It's not just about the finance, the math equation. It's about good planning, eliminating uncertainty. And your point about what's the highest probable outcome, I think that's super important. It's like not the outcome you want to be true, but it's like, what's the highest probable outcome, and it's probably the one you should go with. All these different things, Monte Carlo simulations, GICs, a probate, they all have a role when it's used in the correct context. And a good plan isn't necessarily the best one financially for everyone, but it's one that integrates all your goals into a cohesive kind of plan with steps you can take. And so, Sean, if there's anything else you want to add, I think we can kind of leave it off there.
No, I think it's good. And again, if anyone's interested in getting more information about getting more definitive on their planning, of course, they can visit our website. I think you always put a link there, and there's information about our planning process. If you want kind of more clarity attached to specific numbers in your particular circumstances, we're always welcome a conversation.
All right. Well, thanks for listening. As always, take care. We'll catch you in the next episode.